My name is Brent Cadler. I just got back from racing yesterday. I'm going over the Kart to make sure it's ready to go again for another race weekend. And I'd just like to show you a little bit about what I do with my Kart, so you can maybe make it a little easier for yourself when you get into the sport. First thing I like to do is empty all the fuel out of the fuel tank. This is actually a fuel pump. It's a hand pump. It's designed for fuel use. I got this from Canada Tire. I think the price of this was around $20 or $30 Canadian. Suck out as much gas as you can. Remember, the gas may siphon. Be careful not to spill everywhere. So why is it so important to empty your fuel after the race? Well, I guess it's not critical to your success, but it is a good habit to have. One of the reasons is that you should be keeping your race fuel and your practice fuel separate from each other. Your race fuel, you're going to run a little bit less oil, most likely, but also for your races, you want to make sure you've got fresh gas. You don't want to have old or stagnant fuel. And if you talk to the guys on the grid, a lot of the guys, almost all of them, will use fuel from that morning or from the day before. They won't use fuel that's a week or 2 weeks old. Some of them will, but you know, the guys that are competitive, the guys that want to make sure all those little variables are taken account of, they're going to use as fresh a gas as possible. And some of the clubs may actually require you to get race gas from a specific location, a specific pump, at a specific day, so that the gas and the fuel is all equal for all contestants. Okay, on to the next step. So we're empty with gas, on to the next step. So Rotax engines have a bearing or a bushing, and the bearing and the bushing does require maintenance at fairly tight intervals. Just checking in the manual for the Rotax, if you've got the bearing, it requires service every 2 hours of operation. And if you have the bushing, the general rule of thumb is it requires maintenance after every day of use. So if you go at the kart track and you use it for 3-4 sessions, maybe 5 sessions if you're really ambitious, that's probably 40 or 50 minutes of use. You're going to want to maintain that bushing. First steps first is basically rear wheel and the bumper. They come off. So this is what it looks like back here. And a couple things you're going to notice is you're going to want to do a little inspection on this. There's a couple of problems here that I see already. First is it's quite dirty, and this is not as bad as some people. When you go to the kart track, you'll see some guys where this whole area is covered in mess, and that's from the chain oil that we use on the Rotax. Between each driving session, the guys are highly encouraged to lubricate this chain with oil, and so you do get a lot of oil buildup in this area, chain oil. It makes a bit of a mess. You can kind of see the muck here. And a little bit of grass stains. Yes, I did go off the track. Some things to look for on these sprockets. These sprockets are wear items, and they do not last forever, and they will wear out. And so you're going to want to watch these teeth to make sure they don't get too worn and too sharp. This one is getting a little bit tight up there, so I'm going to continue to use this sprocket for practice, but I would be hesitant possibly to put that one on the race unless I didn't have one to replace it with. So inspecting your sprocket, inspecting the wear on these guys, same thing to make sure it's not overly sharp, and then looking at the general condition of your chain to see how is the chain compared to the last time you put it on. So this is what it's supposed to look like. They say between a ½ inch to an inch of play. And so if you can kind of see the digit on my finger there, it's about not, and that's not very much pressure. Put more, move more. So that's getting pretty close to an inch, which is okay. That's about how tight I put it last time. And so you want to make sure that's the same, because if it's different, that means something's wrong. So either the motor has moved, or your axle's bent, or your sprocket's changed shape, or possibly the chain has elongated and stretched. You have to kind of go through and figure out why it's different than it was last time, and make sure that that is okay and you don't have a maintenance problem there. And the next step will be to actually remove this casing and to remove the clutch housing. And inside of here is the bushing that we're going to be lubricating and just making sure it's okay. If you're running 11 tooth, it's a bushing. If you're running 12, 13, or 14 teeth, it's a bearing. And off she comes. So one of the things to do when you get this off is to clean it up. It's going to be full of stuff. Some cleaners that I would recommend. One of the ones that's very popular is good old WD-40. Another one that's very popular to use is, let's see if I have a can of it here. Well, looks like I've run out. Is brake cleaner. Brake cleaner is really great, either chlorinated or non-chlorinated. Do be careful with the brake cleaner. You do need to protect yourself. Make sure that you're not inhaling too many of the fumes and you don't get it on your skin. It is not that great for your health. Okay, this is clean. On to the next part of the build. The next part of the build, there's a few different ways to do it. It's I'll show you the way that I do it. You're gonna need to lock the flywheel on the Rotax. There's a couple different tools, but my favorite is this little guy. They're about $20 from any Kart store, or you can order them online. It's a flywheel lock tool. It just inserts into the top corner of the engine and kind of locks the flywheel so you can take the clutch off of the engine. So you can kind of see the tool. It just fits right in here into the corner. And it just goes in like that and just holds it and prevents it from rotating so you can get this nut off. So a washer and a nut come off of here. Make sure you watch for the washer because a lot of times it'll just stick up there and then you get working and it drops to the floor and then you lose it. Now you're in trouble. So washer and a nut. Okay, now comes the interesting part. So this has been pulled off and we're going to pull this clutch right out, but it won't come. It's stuck. So this is where there's a little bit of differences. Some guys will just undo this and move this sprocket assembly. Other guys will be working on the sprocket and take the whole thing apart. I just like to pull these two screws here, loosen up this assembly, and then knock it over a little bit, and that'll allow this to come off. There, so this is moved over, and you can actually see it'll actually move by hand because it's nicely lubricated in there. So just want to pull it out just a little bit, and that'll allow this to go right off. And there we go. So this is the 11-tooth clutch housing, and you can see in here, this is the part we're going to have to lubricate. So now that we have this off, we can clean it. You should use brake clean on this only. You do not want to use WD-40 on this. You need this inside to be perfectly clean metal. It's a metal to metal clutch. You don't want to have any residual oil or anything on the inside. And just to show you guys the difference between an 11 and a 12 tooth, you can kind of see how this is the 11, this is the 12. You see the difference in shape. You can also see this one's getting some wear. It's getting a little bit pointier. And this one, the teeth are nice and fat. So this one's getting obviously worn. It's still okay. I'm still going to run this one, but it will require replacing in the near future. The 11 tooth, because it's so narrow inside here, it just has a flat bushing. It's Teflon coated on the inside, but there is nothing inside, whereas the 12 tooth, you can actually see the 12 tooth actually has a bearing, and that bearing is very helpful in reducing wear. It still needs to be greased. This same process applies to the 12 tooth. You just don't need to do it as frequently. Rotax recommends every 2 hours. I'd recommend it every couple of days at the track. Usually doing about 50 minutes to an hour each day at the track. So every couple of days at the track, you should be greasing this one. For sure, this one needs greasing every day at the track. Okay, now is a good time to clean your chain. Often chain cleaner works well. A lot of guys will soak it in oil. There's a lot of different things. You can Google other videos about how to clean your chain. I just give it a good spray. You just want to try and get the grime off the chain, and that'll help it last longer and spin a little freer. The chain is relatively clean. A lot of the grime is off now, so it has to dry, and then we can lubricate it and put it back on the cart. We'll take this chance to clean up the sprocket and just clean the general area. Okay, this is basically after a couple minutes cleaning. It's not obviously perfect and spotless, guys, but it makes a big difference as far as just taking the gross, rough stuff out of it. Okay, so we're going to start lubricating the bushing. Now, you need to use a grease. So this is the grease that all the guys at our kart track use. This is from Mutual Grease Tech 300. You don't need to use this particular product. There's many others you can use. You can use whatever kind of grease you want, to be honest. The guys at your kart track will typically have a product that they'll recommend, and I'd strongly recommend you just stick with whatever they're using. This is what we use in our club, and it works pretty good. So a tube like this is 20 bucks and lasts you for basically your whole lifetime. This will last the whole life of the kart. I'll show you how much grease you actually need on there. So basically a little pea-sized granule of grease. That's it. Spread it around with your finger. Make sure it gets everywhere. And that's basically it. Like, the amount is almost ridiculously small. If you have too much grease on there, it's not a big deal, but what will end up happening over time is you'll get grease packing into these little edges in here, and it'll actually kind of push on that O-ring in the back, and you'll end up with the whole assembly kind of sticking out, and then it just won't work. You'll get, actually I'll show you, you won't get the clearances you need here. And when you go to redo the bolt and the washer, you'll see that it drags quite a bit. So if you have too much grease over too much time, you'll get lots of buildup on the inside. And you can just clean that buildup out. You don't need as much grease as you think. Because we're doing this after every day, it just doesn't take much grease. Okay, now to put the chain and the clutch and everything together. The chain has to go, it has to all go together at the same time. .30 foot-pounds is all you require. So, got a nice little torque wrench. Now we just have to level the chain up. So the easiest way to do that is with a straight edge. Basically put it flat on there and watch to make sure that it's even on this side. You should be able to move this by hand. If you can't, then it's probably either too tight binding or it's not lubricated underneath. So try and get it so it moves just nicely by hand. There. So we're flat on the back and we're just contacting the front. Flat on the back, contacting the front, and that's perfect. So now we can go ahead, tighten these bolts up. They don't need to be mega tight, they just need to be regular tight, and this shouldn't move around a lot. Make sure that everything spins freely and it's got nice, just with 2 fingers I can turn the whole axle. The biggest source of drag on this axle will likely be from the brakes. You don't want to have a lot of drag here, you don't want your chain to be dragging, you don't want your bearings to be dragging, everything needs to be flowing nicely. So like I said, we're going to tighten this up, pull the pin, and put the covers back on. Okay, so there we go, covers back on. We've done this, we've done the chain, we've cleaned up the grease area with grease. So basically, this part of the kart is ready to go. Okay, other things to go over. All of the physical maintenance on the kart is now done, but there is a few things just to be aware of. So you do want to make sure you keep track of how long your air filter's been going for, and whether you've crashed or you've put a bunch of dirt into it. You may want to change the filter or clean it. Just going around the kart and making sure things are good. You know, a walk around is very important because you'll catch things, and you want to catch them before something happens on the track. So I'm just going to go through the kart very quickly and show you some of the areas that I look for, that I've seen problems crop up on my kart, and you may want to look on yours as well. Okay? Okay, so very simple. I always start at the front and work my way back. So I check to make sure my bumper clips are still in place and tight. I check to make sure that all the linkages and the springs are still good. These bolts, I've seen these come out. They quite frequently get worn down and ground down and get loose. So I always just like to make sure I give them an inspection to know that they're not coming loose. And I quickly look. You can see I have a skid plate on mine, but just to make sure that they're doing okay. just to give a quick visual. I look to make sure that this is okay. I don't want to see any leaking or any exhaust or black around here, because if you do, you've got an exhaust flange leak here, and that can be caused from one of two problems. One is that your gasket's toast. Most certainly your gasket's toast. But the other problem to look for is to make sure your exhaust is not binding. You actually want your exhaust to move. It should not be hard mounted. So just with a hand, you should be able to, you do want to be able to see it, the rubber isolator, and you want to be able to see it move and move just with a little bit of 3 fingers, and that whole thing is moving. You want that, because if the exhaust, as it grows and shrinks with temperature, it needs to be able to flex and move, and if it can't move, it's going to put stress on that weakest spot, which will be over here, and it'll create it to geometry to change, and if your gasket's not perfect, it'll start leaking. Okay, so the other thing to look for is just to make sure that your hoses are okay. Make sure that your little catch cans are not full or haven't blown a bunch of stuff out. Make sure that everything here looks good. Make sure your axle's not bent. So it's very common when you bump somebody or hit something on a track for these axles to bend. So just rotate them by hand and look. If you see any movement whatsoever, even the tiniest little bit, then I would pull that axle out and run it on a flat surface to make sure. One of the things to really check for is to make sure that these axle hubs haven't moved. So you'll typically set them at a certain distance, and I can go over a video for that later. But you should get familiar with where they sit on your keys, and they should be exactly there. If they've moved at all, then you're going to have to put them back. You want to make sure your wheels are equidistant, that they're at the dimensions that you want for your setup. Another video for setup, and these bolts have to be super tight, like as tight as you can get them. They're really, really important to get these tight, because when you get some wheel-to-wheel bumping and banging, this is going to put under a lot of stress. It's going to move. You'll know it's going to move. It's not tight enough here. You should have some reference points on your axles as well. It's very common during a race that these little screws are what holds your axles in place. There's screws on this bearing. There's typically none on this bearing, and there will for sure be 3 or 4 on this bearing. These have to be quite tight, as tight as you're able to get them without stripping them or damaging them. And it's very common for people to have their axles shift. So you should know what this measurement is for your setup, and you should make sure it's equidistant. So inside of bearing to inside of bearing. And these distances here to the same points of reference here, they should be the same. Now, you shouldn't have to check this all the time, because you'll do this when you're setting up your cart, but just after a race, make sure it hasn't moved. Some guys will score the axle with a little mark just so they can see that it hasn't moved. Some guys will use pen or paint. So just little tricks to try and help know that things are moving. If things are moving, not so good. These little guys, here and here and here, and these little bolts, check them. They move, they get loose, and they need to be, set at the appropriate tightness. Your bumper, I can't tell you how many people will lose bumper bolts. Make sure that they're in and they're not turning. Make sure that these are in and not coming loose. Little bolts on the bumpers tend to always come loose, and you'll see guys asking for spare bolts because stuff has come loose. On the front end, you're going to want to just make sure that nothing's obviously changed. And on this one, you can see there's some damage. That's damage that we'll be fixing in another video. And that's really about it. Make sure everything's tight. Okay, so the cart is all back together. Wheels are on. Everything's more or less maintained. And that's really all it takes to get this thing ready for the next race. I'd like to thank Joey from Overdrive Karting, who's taught me quite a bit. But specifically, I'd really like to thank Dan Lazar, who took me under his wing and mentored me a lot and got me up to speed in the sport. A lot of this information comes from those two gentlemen. If you liked the video, please leave your comments below, and I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks.
Bye.